In our discussion of the Federal Reserve and its policies, we've mentioned the importance of private borrowing and spending. That's what the Federal Reserve attempts to control through its monetary policies. We've especially focused our attention on household borrowing and business borrowing. Now this chart 6.3, shows all private borrowing, and of course today's figures, $2,400 billion or $2.4 trillion. Today's figures are massive compared to those of 30 years ago, when they were less than $1 trillion and even less than half of that. But I want you to notice something, despite the vastness of the scale, that way back around 1970, total private borrowing was about $100 billion annually. By the mid-70s, it had risen to $200 billion annually. By the late 70s, $400 billion annually. In other words, borrowing was doubling every 5 years. Now, let's focus on that. What's the importance of borrowing? Well, borrowing is crucial in fueling spending. Let's think about it this way. Suppose I produce $1 worth of goods, and therefore I earn $1, and therefore I can spend $1. Now, under those circumstances, prices shouldn't change. I produce $1, I earn $1, I buy what I produce with that $1. But suppose I produce $1, I earn $1, and I can borrow another $1, and so now I spend $2 on that $1 worth of goods. Well, clearly, prices will rise. I'll bid the price of that $1 worth of product up to $2. So the amount of borrowing is crucial. Borrowing enables spending. That's why the Federal Reserve focuses on interest rates to control the level of borrowing. Well, back in the 70s, as I said, every 5 years the level of borrowing doubled, 100, 200, 400. And just think how it would have expanded and grown even more rapidly than the data you see on this chart. In other words, it would have been $800 billion by the middle of the 80s, $1,600 billion by the late 80s, $3,200 billion by the middle 90s, and off the chart very, very quickly. When the Federal Reserve tightened up in the early 80s, it really slowed the growth of borrowing, even though you can see there have been times when borrowing has grown very, very rapidly. We see a spike in the early 80s and then a plateau. In the late 90s, borrowings declined. Lately, borrowing has grown, and you might say, well, how can we reconcile this growth of borrowing, which fuels spending, with the relatively low rates of inflation we've had lately? Well, let's look at the new economy borrowing of the 90s. It really made up for the poor performance, for borrowing's poor performance in the late 80s and early 90s, when borrowing slacked off to quite an extent. And remember what was crucial about the new economy spending. This spending was to a large extent spending by businesses on new capacity, on new technology. And as a consequence, the economy was able to produce, to turn out more goods. And as the economy turned out more goods with this additional capacity, that held inflation down. It was different in the late 90s from the 70s, when the borrowing was so heavily oriented toward households, and in those days, heavy spending by households on homes and cars bid prices upward relatively rapidly, and very rapidly. In the late 90s, the surge in borrowing did not have that effect. Inflation remained relatively low. Now, as the economy weakened with the dot-com bubbles bursting, borrowing plateaued at around 1.2 trillion annually. And then when the Federal Reserve eased up, there was another surge in borrowing. This especially associated with households borrowing and spending on residential construction. Households mortgage borrowing in order to finance new home construction. Now, because the economy was in a slump in the years 2000, 2001, 2002, this stimulus of residential construction and of autos didn't have a market inflationary impact. Inflation remained low. Although by the year 2005, 2006, 2007, the Federal Reserve was concerned and was mindful of this surge in borrowing, had helped push interest rates up, and through its policies was trying to control the rapid growth of borrowing. Now, the economy we face in 2007 is not the same economy we faced in 1977, 30 years ago. Nowadays, international competition helps keep inflation under check. But nonetheless, you should follow the instructions provided in this module and keep track of borrowing yourself. Private borrowing is very important. If it should continue to grow very rapidly, it'll be difficult to continue to keep inflation in check. If borrowing begins to ease off and stops growing so rapidly, that'll be a signal to the Federal Reserve that demand will cool, or even has cooled, and the inflationary threat is no longer as strong as it had been.